Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Creative Leadership Podcast. My name is Arne van Oostrom and this podcast is brought to you by Blue Sky Republic. And no, I'm not going to talk about Ukraine, about the war that's going on. I'm not going to talk about wars and the you know, I can't even find the words. I am, and people my age, we grew up with the USSR being this constant shadow and threat. And you kind of think, people get smarter. We won't, we become more, things get better. Things get better, and we're not, I'm frustrated. Can you tell? I'm totally frustrated. I feel powerless and frustrated. I'm not going to talk about war. I'm going to talk about something that is equally important. Yes, I dare to say it's equally important. It's about sex and gender medicine, and that is something we have to fix as well. If you're not familiar with that topic, you will be after this podcast. I have a very special guest. My guest today is Sabine Oertelt-Prigione. She is a professor of sex and gender medicine. She's also an amazing person that has been traveling all of her life, a constant migrant. And I'm very proud to have her as my guest. I think she's doing tremendously important work. And I love her energy and her story. So enjoy.
Probably one of the things that defines me most is the fact that I've basically been a constant migrant my entire life. And so I do think that it's a very defining aspect because it affects how you approach life, at least how I approach my life. It affects how you deal with things, how you deal with things that work well, how you deal with things that don't work well. It's how you choose your friends, how you choose your work. So I think for me, it's actually probably one of the most defining parts of who I am. So yeah, it tells you where I come from, but it tells you where I come from on many levels.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So, and it is. I can imagine it's confusing for people. I can also imagine that it's maybe sometimes confusing for yourself, because there are so many elements that you take from all the places that you've been and all the things that you've done, and the people that you meet. But I'm interested in where did that start? Because where do you start becoming a migrant? When did that happen?
My parents moved to Italy when I was 3. So that's where it was. I was born in Germany and then I didn't choose. I was moved. So that's basically what happened. They placed me there and I was like, okay, go ahead, find your way. Which was kind of a shock. Apparently I didn't speak a word of Italian for like 2 years. So people would talk to me and I would refuse to reply in the language. Until from one day to the next, I started replying, and apparently I was fluent in Italian. So
really?
From not saying anything, so apparently I was just accumulating how to understand these people, and then at a certain point I just started speaking, and from there on, it was I was fluent. But it must have been a culture shock, I'm pretty sure, because I mean the times were different. We're talking about 40 years ago. So of course it was different at the time. I mean, there was no Schengen. We had different money. The cultures were quite segregated still in Europe. So it must have been quite impressive. And then so that's pretty much how I grew up. Then I went to a German school in Italy, but it was a bilingual school. So I kind of grew up with 2 cultures anyway. And then I stayed there for a while. But it was always clear, I think, that I wouldn't stay put in one place just because. I think if you grow up like that, it's just part of your natural, I don't know, it developed a sort of natural curiosity in trying to, it couldn't be just that. I had to understand other cultures. I had to learn from other people. And I think the essential part is in growing up like that, is that you realize early on there's no right or wrong. So there are maybe similar problems that people deal with, but they will find their solutions, and all of their solutions make sense in their own right. And so you don't grow up with this feeling of, okay, for this thing there's this solution, or where if that is the question, this is the answer.
All
So I
right.
think growing up between cultures really, really helps in that respect, because right
Yeah.
from the start, that there's never going to be one answer.
Yes, of course, because you are confronted with very different ways of doing things and seeing things, and different languages, different cultures. But you kind of took a big leap here. I'm still where you are 3, and
Okay.
then you accumulate a language. And at what age? I mean, did it take years for you to start speaking fluently
I
Italian, or what was it? How long did that take?
I think what they told me, it was like 1.5 to 2 years until
Ah,
I spoke.
so you're like
Like I don't know, because I
4,
was too young, so I have no memory of that really. It's just what they tell me.
but you're
It was like,
4 or 5
yeah,
ish
yeah,
when you started speaking
yeah,
fluently
yeah.
Italian. Oh yeah, obviously there is I mean, children, I mean, being fluent in a language as a child of 4 is different than being fluent as an adult, right?
No, but apparently then I was like fluent, so I was able
Okay.
to speak
Awesome.
appropriately. And I do. It's funny because I see that in my own kid. So she
Yeah.
speaks several languages, and it's funny because she was born in Germany, and so in the beginning she spoke German, but she speaks Italian with her dad, and she went to an international kindergarten where she spoke English with people. But the thing was, people spoke in English or in Italian to her, and she would reply in German. So for her, when she was little, until she was about 3 years old, for her, it was perfectly normal that somebody would speak to her in Italian or in English, and she would reply in German. And she expected them to understand. So when she met the grandparents, the Italian grandparents, for one of the first times when she was speaking,
Uh-huh.
she would reply in German, and they would speak Italian. She understood it, but they didn't understand her. So for her, the entire communication thing, she was like, why do they not understand what I'm saying? And I think that was the first time she actually realized that she had to speak in that language for them to understand. So that's when she started actually speaking Italian and English. And her time to catch up was really fast because she understood everything. She just didn't speak. And so
Yeah.
I think it's kind of a similar mechanism where you understand what people say to you.
Mm.
It's just the barrier. I mean, even as adults, when I moved to the Netherlands in the beginning, I understood fairly well after a short amount of time, but I wasn't able to convey my thoughts as fast. So
Hmm.
it took me about a year to be fluent, because my expectation even now was like, if I talk to people, I don't want to have to think about every second word I'm saying. So
Sure.
I want to be able to actually have a conversation. And so I think that's really the different layers of what kind of expectation you also have towards yourself in communicating with others.
Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. And it does, I mean, it does tell you something about how you grew up and how you have developed. And I mean, it's obviously, I mean, not everyone will be kind of that quick, not that quickly fluent. But in your case, because of your upbringing and the way you kind of dealt with languages throughout your life, you were also able to kind of become fluent in Dutch, which is for some people it takes a lifetime or they never make it because of it's a very different language again. So it's also quite astounding, really, to that you are able to become fluent and quick and don't have to think, or you can actually start thinking in the language, because I think that's probably the switch it makes. That it's
Yeah.
often after a while you start thinking in the language, so you don't have to translate your thoughts into another language, right? But again, you're making a big leap here. I'm still where you now are. You 4.5, and you start speaking fluent, and you go to an international school. Why did your parents move to Italy?
Oh, for my dad's job. So
What did he
he
do?
was working in the industry, and he was working for a big German company, and so they just sent him there. They
Oh.
actually they had spent some time in Indonesia before that, before I was
Hmm.
born.
Ah,
They were like,
okay.
okay, with the baby, that might not be the best location at that moment in time, and
Yeah.
so they offered them to go to Italy, but they were supposed to go for 3 years. So that's
Ah,
why I went to a German school there, because they're like, okay, whenever we move back, you will have to go
right.
to a German school. Assuming, but they were still
Okay.
assuming naively that they would move back
Okay.
after 3 years.
Okay. So, but your parents were also kind of migrants then, maybe not as much as you became, but I mean,
Well, they were definitely open for it, I would say. I mean, they lived in Germany before that, and then they had this other experience before moving to Italy, where they stayed in Indonesia, and then yeah, I guess it was more of a they were definitely open for that. I think they were also they said that they didn't want to stay in Germany forever, so they wanted to have experiences abroad as well. So I guess that was also something that was kind of the feeling I think you get is, you know, you're being raised in an environment where it is seen positively
yeah.
to go out there to try to, you know, make things work in another country where you don't speak the language at first, you don't know anything, and you know everything is difficult and weird in the beginning, and you just make it work. So I think that was kind of the spirit probably that yeah, you get you know you grow up with.
Uh-huh. And so then after you went to that school, that international school, you're still in Italy. Where did you go next? What was the school you went to next?
Well, I studied medicine in Milan.
Mm-hmm.
I stayed there. So I went to a Italian university, which was also interesting. Moving from a bilingual, somewhat more international. It was bilingual, so bicultural, if you want. To a traditional Italian university was also interesting. So you had to switch the learning process. So that was a bit of a challenge for me because the German school system at the time compared to the Italian school system was a lot about, you know, still encouraging discussion and encouraging you to question a lot of the things that you do and kind of preparing you to think on your own and so forth. And then you move to the Italian university system, which is a lot of learn by heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, you know, I learned to deal with it and I found my own way of dealing with it. But the first 1.5 years were really challenging because it was just different, and also the way that it was done was different. Nobody was interested in my opinions about what I learned. They just wanted me to show that I learned
Right.
this stuff. It's also true that in the beginning of the medical curriculum, that's pretty much what you do. You just learn basics by heart, but that was kind of difficult. It clashed a bit with my personality. I didn't have to question stuff. I just had to learn it. So that was interesting, I must say. I and also because it's the first 1.5 to 2 years is very far away from clinical practice. So I was really wondering, is this what I wanted to do? I was wondering if I should quit altogether and do something else. And I was like, okay, I'll give myself a little bit longer just until we start seeing patients to see if that's actually what I was looking for.
Uh-huh.
And then that happened. So like in the third year, I started going to doing rounds on wards. And that was the switch because at that moment in time, I felt like, okay, this is what I wanted to do. This is why I went into medicine. And it changed the whole outlook because from that moment on, the way I thought made sense again, because when you have somebody in front of you with a problem, somebody who's sick, you have to figure out why they're sick and you have to think about things, you have to question things. And so my whole mindset was helpful again. And also I was doing what I thought I would go to do. And so it started all coming together again.
But why medicine in the first place? What makes you?
I think I wanted to help people and I wanted to do something that had a social impact. And I really got to the point where
When did you serve? Because that's interesting. Because when do you realize that? When was the moment? Yeah, I want to have social impact.
oh
When does
that
it?
is what I realized afterwards. But I when
Oh,
when
okay.
I
All right. That's okay. Good. Because I was
that's
like,
it's in
when?
hindsight. What I wanted to do at the time, I would tell you, I wanted to help people. But I wanted to
Mm,
be a veterinarian when I was a kid. So I actually didn't want to be a human doctor. I wanted to be an animal doctor. But then because I basically was unafraid of animals at all. I would hug the biggest dog, like my parents would have multiple heart attacks. Seeing like giant dog, I would just go there, hug them, put my hand in their mouth, and somehow the animals feel if you're scared or not. So if
oh
they
yeah,
feel
yeah,
that you're not scared, no animal will hurt you. And so I really loved all of that. And then but I came to a point where I realized that I wouldn't be able to deal with animals being sick. So because the whole point dealing with humans who are sick, you can talk to them. and you can, you can explain what's going on, and you can, there's a shared decision making process and everything. And with animals, you can't. And I somehow felt I can't do. That's probably the reason why I couldn't do into pediatrics. I couldn't deal with little children, because you cannot explain yet, and you see them suffering, you don't know what to do. So that kind of doesn't work for me. So anyway, so I moved from, okay, I'm not going to do animals. And then I had this short phase where like, oh, maybe I'm going to go into psychology. And then I realized, okay, I'm just a teenager. I should just try to figure out what's going on with myself. And I don't necessarily have to study that. So I can just try to figure out what the issue is. And then I was left with medicine, and I was like, okay, that's it. I don't really know what else I could do at this point. So there, sometimes when people set out to study something, okay, I like this and I like that, and I could do that as well. And for me at that moment, it was like, yeah, I want to do medicine. I'm just going to do that. I'll be a doctor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's great. I mean, that's great, because actually,
I didn't know which doctor. So the questions come afterwards. But at that moment in time, I was like, okay, I'm going to be a doctor. At least I'm going to try. And then I just got in. So
yeah.
I started.
Yeah, but you wanted to help people, and you, somehow it had to do with medicine, whether it's animals or humans. It's making better. I mean, you can help people in many ways. You don't have to become a doctor per se, but it's also interesting that you chose and you decided that's it. Because I also know a lot of people when growing up, and I was one of them. They were like, I have no clue. Helping people, it's usually, I think a lot of people, I would say, yeah, helping people would be nice, but then it doesn't automatically go to doctor. But it's interesting that you've had that kind of clarity, but then you went to an Italian school where it was culturally quite different, having to learn. So I have some doctors in my family, and I remember them going to school and having to learn by heart all these words and books, like thick books, and I all have to memorize all that stuff, which is so one of the reasons why I thought I never will be able to do anything like that ever, because I can't remember anything. How can you remember these things? And that obviously at that time it wasn't as logical maybe now to say, well, we have computers. Yeah. There's artificial intelligence even that can memorize things better than I do. But then you say, okay, then you started really seeing patients, and that's in your third year, right? Yeah. But that was sort of where you thought, okay, yeah, this is, I can reason, humans. I can explain, I can be opinionated now. Like I say, was that kind of something that was, felt, it felt good for you, but was there in the Italian culture still, was that also your personality? Was that okay in that sense? Or did you already kind of started clashing?
The thing is, I have like this strange, and I always had, and I think I always will have this strange insider-outsider perspective. So when I speak Italian, you cannot hear that I'm not Italian. So I have no accent whatsoever. And until they see my last name, they don't realize that I'm not Italian. And so at the time, what you would get is like everything that I did that was strange was justified with the fact, oh yeah, but you're German. Although I grew up in Italy. But then if I did something that was good, it's like, yeah, but you're one of us. So you kind of had this thing that and in the beginning, it's strange because you feel like somewhat at the border of, are you included or excluded? And while growing up, it's hard because you will never fully fit in. But then as you get older, what I learned was to live with that, to kind of harness that as some kind of special superpower where you do understand how the system works inside, but you're not fully part of it because you give up the expectation to ever be completely integrated in that nucleus of people because you don't share all of their cultural values. So regardless of where it is, so in my experience, it was in Italy, it could be anywhere. And you realize that, you understand part of it, you share part of it, but not all of it. And I think that's when this started developing much more. And I think it was also one of the bigger pushes to say, okay, this is not it for my entire life. I'm not going to be here forever. I need to see other places. And, just once you realize that you will never be fully part of this system, and maybe you don't want to, that's the other part. I think I'm a bit of a contrarian for certain things, so maybe I don't even want to. I could have integrated even more, maybe. You're like, okay, but now I want to explore this fully. So at that point, you're like, okay, I'm going to see a lot of other different places. At the time when I started medicine, I wanted to go to Africa and become a tropical medicine doctor. So that was kind of my idea. It changed a bit over the years. But anyway, so it was, the idea was never, okay, I'm going to be done here and then I want to have a linear career and become, whatever, the director of the department in this hospital here. That was never something I was aspiring to. And I still don't.
So, I mean, but you were, when did you become aware of that kind of, because that's a mindset that you have, like, it's going to be one big adventure, basically. Were you really conscious of that, or was it more like a feeling? Do you really I'm going to be doing all kinds of things?
I think that I somewhere between the transition, in your late teens to early 20s, that just became somewhat clear that I never wanted a boring life. So that probably was also one of the things that was clear from the beginning. I always thought, well, we only have that much time. And in that time that I'm given, I want to learn as much as possible. I want to try to understand as much as possible. And to do that, I cannot stay put in one place for the entirety of my life. So that's simply not going to work. And since for me, a lot of the learning, I mean, I read a lot of books and I learned that as well. But a lot of the learning is really in human interaction, where you hear people's stories and you hear their solutions for their problems, and you hear their points of views. And I think this is really where you also grow and kind of integrate what you learn emotionally, and it just becomes such a bigger picture, and it's just fun. It's just a lot of fun over time, and you also, on the one hand side, you're constantly challenged because you're always in a learning perspective, right? You're never the total expert of something. You just, every time you have to put yourself in this position that you sit at the table with somebody who probably knows more or a lot more than what you know about that. So that's a nice thing in a way, because it forces you to grow constantly, to adapt, to learn new things.
Yeah, but you have to be courageous as well. It takes courage, right? Because you are also never then that expert and the person that knows everything about that one specific thing. So, I can imagine that a lot of people will choose to become something like an expert in something and really start kind of zooming in on one element, because it's security. It gives them security, and the sense of security of, if in your case, it's completely gone, really, because first of all, you don't know where you're going. You don't know where you're going to end up. You're always the migrant, So even if you, even in the school that actually the country that you grew up, where you speak the language fluently, you're part of that life, you're still sort of a migrant because of your last name, and also because of your kind of sort of your attitude towards things, I guess. But that's so that you never felt like, I want to. In your life, have you ever felt this moment that, like, I want to have like sort of one place, one route? Yeah, these are my roots. I'm back where I belong.
I think that I grew up in a way that I didn't have these roots. So I think that's probably the point. I think if as a kid, let's say for the first, 6 to 10 years of your life, you are very rooted somewhere in one place or something, I think then you develop this kind of feeling of roots. I never really had that. So for me, it was kind of like, where my family is, or, where your loved ones are, that's your home. And that still is kind of like that. take around my stuff with myself, but home can be pretty much anywhere. I don't know, I've moved, I think 17 or 18 times by now. And it's just, I take a lot of stuff with me. So you get more attached to some of your things. I mean,
so the truck is getting bigger.
The truck is getting bigger. Yeah, exactly. That's what happens a bit over time. But in general, the place can be anywhere. But you're totally right. I mean, you give up that feeling of safety that is rooted in the expertise and, let's say, the social prestige and recognition with that. And you also give up a lot of the certainty about your future. And I think it's, on the one hand side, it's a personality trait. I think it's a bit of, I deal well with uncertainty. So but the other thing is also, the more you do it, the less scared you become. So, in your life, if things go wrong, or let's say they go differently, then I don't really think there is a wrong. But if things go differently than planned, and you see that you still manage and you somehow get out on the other side, and that happens a few times, you get less and less scared of uncertainty, because you know that in one way or another, you'll find a solution. So I think that's a bit of something that kind of perpetuate itself. It gives you, the more you are exposed to these things, the more you're like, oh, I don't really have to be scared of any of these things. I'll be fine. So that's one thing. And the other one with uncertainty professionally, of course, I would say it's a bit of a challenge also in my field, because I work in research, and in a way, the whole system is mostly built for people to pick one topic and invest their entire life in studying that one topic and digging deeper and deeper into it. And I'm not 100% that person, which also makes me a slightly different type of researcher, or doesn't put me, I don't fit in a lot of the typical boxes that you have to tick. And again, it's also the same situation where you're a bit of an insider outsider and you try to navigate that condition. So what's the advantage of knowing the technique, knowing the methodology, being able to speak the language, but on the other hand, having a more activist perspective and trying to bring that out? So how can I walk this border between different worlds? So
okay, so you're at school in Italy. You started, working with people. You like that. Then, so you graduated, obviously, and then what?
So first, while I was studying, I went to Brazil for a few months I did an internship first, and then I traveled around. I was like, yes, that's that fits. I want to do other things, and that was still during my studies, but it was one of those moments where you're like, yeah, see, that's what I mean. And I learned Portuguese, by the way, when I moved there.
Of course.
Because they told me that they would speak English and they had a really hard time. And for me, speaking Italian, it was easier to learn.
But Brazilian Portuguese.
Yeah.
With the Brazilian accent.
Yes, which sounds much more melodic. But I still understand. I don't speak it really anymore. I would have to go back to pick it up. But anyway, okay. So I did that experience. And I was like, okay, this is what I like. And I was still convinced that I would do tropical medicine. And then I started my residency. And then my boss was like, okay, we have this offer. You could go to California to do basic research for several years. And I was like, that wasn't exactly what I was planning. So I was planning to go to Africa, get my hands dirty, and work in some kind of rural environment, doing, I don't know, vaccinations and disease prevention. So it was a very different idea. But then I was like, okay, this is what I'm offered now. And I mean, California isn't that bad. Let's face it. If they'd offered some other place, maybe. But I was like, okay, this is what just happened. What do you do if things fall from the sky? You just pick them the way they are. So I say, okay, let's do that. I wasn't really interested in basic research, but I thought, well, it's still something to learn. It will help me understand a lot of the exams that we do better, and it's going to be fun to move to California. So I moved there for 3 years.
That's
it's something different. So, it was the first stronger pivot that was really not a piece of somewhat unexpected.
Yeah. So, but that was more. Was that something that you would consider like, or was the Brazilian one also a proper job? Like,
No, that was
was
an internship. So it wasn't
yeah.
a proper job. It wasn't an intern. It was still, I wasn't done with my studies that yet. So
Mm,
it was interesting as a moment to realize, okay, I like this. And I like the idea of being thrown in a completely different environment and
hmm.
just, kind of make it work. And because I went there and then of course I got sick. I had pneumonia when I got there. So I
Oh,
had to be a patient in the system first.
okay. Well,
Fortunately, it wasn't too bad, so I kind of recovered relatively fast. I moved. I went there before starting my internship, so by the time I had to start work, I was actually fit. So I'm very well integrated in the neoliberal system. So I went in there. But yeah, so it was interesting because I got to be a patient as well. And then and then I traveled around the country for a while, but I just thought that it kind of fit in my ideas of what I wanted to do. But yeah, then I had a completely different offer, which didn't match that path, but it just happened. And I think that is an essential point where I could have said no because it didn't
mm,
fit exactly into what I was thinking I should be doing. And I think it was one of the first times where I was like, okay, this is not exactly what I was planning, but it sounds interesting and I'm just gonna give it a shot, do my best for the time I'm there and then see what happens. And I'm really glad I did because I think that changed a lot of what I did afterwards. So
what did it
moving,
change?
well, I moved there when I was 26. Yeah, I was 26. And so I really moved there, I think, at an essential development time professionally, I think, because you're done with the basics. You kind of learned, you are professionally prepared to a certain point, but you're not so set in your work life yet that you
Mm,
will not change anymore. So I think it was like a good window of opportunity for learning a lot of influential things that could have changed my approach. And so I went there to study immunology. So like the immune system was what I said. And I did learn about that. But what I mostly learned about was how the research system works. And I think I
right.
really credit my ability to navigate it afterwards to those years I had there because
Hmm.
I really from the boss I had there, he got me involved and I reviewed a lot and I read a lot. And so that really helped me in understanding how the whole structure of the system is managed.
Hmm.
And the thing is that in the US, you meet a lot of people who at a certain point of their career might say, okay, I've got to stop doing this. I do something completely different, which happens rarely. I mean, at the time happened rarely in Europe. So, to have people which decide to do completely different things at a certain point of their career, and it's perfectly accepted, was a quite different attitude that I would have seen in the medical field in Italy at the time, where, your option is you become either a hospital doctor or a doctor in private practice, and mostly you'll be a hospital doctor. That's what you're going to do for the next 40 years. So
Right.
that's pretty much what the outlook was like, which just I didn't see for myself anyway. But this just reinforced the fact that you can choose what you like and be successful with it or be happy with it, and you don't necessarily have to follow a beaten track. So that was
Mm.
really the message, the take home message from those years.
And is California also the moment that you started becoming a researcher? Is that because
Yeah, I think so.
I mean,
Yeah.
from doctor, from
Yeah, yeah.
doctor and tropical medicine to researcher.
Yeah, no, I think that was yeah, it was because I was trained in research craft in a
Hmm.
way. So it was also the moment where I kind of got more into that. And yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. And so what happened after? So
So
because you you
I could have
moved
stayed.
a
I could have
gazillion times, so I've never
Yeah, so
so
I was still convinced that I could be a tropical medicine doctor. So my boss there was
ah
like, you should stay here. You will have a wonderful career here. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not a basic researcher. So after 3 years, I realized that it's interesting, but I'm way too impatient for basic research.
ah
So that was the crucial moment. So I told him, you know what, I'm going to go back to Europe and I still want to do tropical medicine. And he kind of looked at me and was like, okay, well, whatever you want, you're going to be successful, whatever you want to do. And I'm like, yeah, that's a very American thing to say. But in principle, he was like, he was kind of giving me his blessing. He was like, you have to do what you want to do, whatever makes you happy. So, I'm sorry that you're going, but go. Which I also appreciated in a way very much, looking at other experiences. It was a very I taught you what I could teach you. We would have liked you to stay here, but go ahead and do whatever you want to do. So I moved back to Italy. I finished my residency in internal medicine, still convinced that I could be doing tropical medicine. I went to South Africa, did another internship like in Brazil. But then I realized that, my husband works in basic research. And so if I wanted to be a tropical medicine specialist somewhere in the world, that wouldn't have been compatible with that relationship.
Where did the husband come from? When when was he interested?
He came to California a little bit after I moved there. So we knew each other from Milan.
Right.
And then he came after a while. Once he managed to come there, he came there too. We got married in San Francisco. Which wasn't planned, but it was fun, so we did it. We didn't know. We actually got married in the city hall where Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera got married.
Really?
We found that out decades later. But so we did that without inviting families and stuff. So we did we're just going to do that for fun. And so we did that. So anyway, we came back. And the point was, we kind of want to stay together, and staying together, if one of you works in basic research with stem cells, which costs a lot of money and needs a lot of structure, and the other one wants to stay somewhere in the jungle, it's not really feasible. So it's kind of difficult to combine those two. And so I figured maybe it's not necessarily the tropical medicine aspect, it's the healthcare system aspect. So what was bothering me was that I kept treating single people, but the problems in the system were always the same. So it's like, you heal the person, you heal the patient if you're lucky. But somehow these things keep coming and coming, and you realize there are so many things that don't work in the system. So I figured maybe, as usual, I need to see the bigger picture. So maybe the point is not so much diving into another specialty. I had actually picked internal medicine because I couldn't choose. So I picked internal medicine because potentially I could do a bit of everything. And so I was like, maybe I shouldn't pick a super specialty. I'm going to do public health. So I actually take it to a broader level. I try to understand the system. So I finished the residency in Italy. It was totally clear that I wouldn't stay there. And at the time, we had planned to go back to the US. So I had the opportunity to do a master's in public health in New York. And the other opportunity, if that didn't go through, I had a position as a postdoc there. And then what happened was the financial crisis of 2008. So a lot of the funding was wiped out. The situation was very unclear and everything. So we figured maybe it's smarter to stay in Europe for a while, simply because it was very unpredictable to move back to the US as foreigners, because I would have had to have a visa, and that was complicated anyway. So we figured we stay in Europe. And there were only two places which would have worked. One was London, one was Berlin, and I found a job in Berlin right away. So the point was, everything was set to go to New York. The financial crisis, we already had an apartment there. So the financial crisis hit. It was clear we wouldn't be able to go. So for a few weeks, we were like, okay, what do we do now? So that was another big pivotal moment where you think, okay, I'm going in that direction. And at a certain point, you're like, no, there's a wall. You cannot go in that direction. That direction is not available anymore. Mm-hmm. And so, that was one of the moments where you're like, okay, I kind of try to fall on my feet and try to figure out what to do. And so the other option was Berlin. And within a few weeks, we both found jobs there. We found an apartment there. We're like, okay, so Berlin it is.
And what was the job in Berlin?
It was at the Institute of Gender in Medicine. So at that point, I had worked on immunology and why women get more autoimmune disease than men in the United States. So I had picked up that topic. It was an essential aspect of my clinical work. And I thought, well, it's actually interesting. I always had a bit of this, social justice aspect to my work. So when I was still studying in Milan, I was working with an NGO that would provide healthcare to undocumented migrants, and so this aspect of kind of social justice was always essential. So I thought, well, the gender aspect is actually interesting. I've done sex differences, but let's look at the broader picture. Let's understand if there's something more to that. And so I just, there was an opening at the Institute of Gender and Medicine in Berlin. I didn't even know the thing existed. So I found the job opening, I applied, and I got the job. So we moved to Berlin. And then I started working there. And in the meantime, I did a master's in public health in London, because the master in Berlin wasn't really that great. So I'm not gonna. So I figured it's better if I do it in London. So I did like this blended format, and at the same time I was working. So I was building up my work there, and I wanted to learn more about public health in general, more as a tool to bring into my work. And so that's where I started kind of combining a lot of the things that I've done. And what I also realized was that there is a huge implementation problem in medicine, which is not specific to my field. It's an implementation problem we have in general. So we have a lot of knowledge, but of all that knowledge we have, only a fraction ends up in practice, because of several different reasons. And a lot of them are really structural, and a lot of them have to do with organizational systems and so forth. So it's not necessarily just knowledge transfer, so people know it and they can do it, because in a lot of aspects in medicine, many things go through guidelines which you have to change, or even just changes in the way the hospital is structured. It takes a long time to do these things and so forth. So for me, to understand how to implement things better, so how do I bring this knowledge about sex and gender differences in medicine, which is accumulating and is important and has a social justice aspect, which I liked, into practice, how do I do that? So I also trained as an organizational consultant for 2 years next to the job. I always did a lot of things in parallel. So because I got bored easily. So it's okay, I'm going to do that one, which was great. It was probably the best invested money in the last 10 years. So doing that training really...
Why did you think that?
I'm going to come to it. It kind of opened up a whole new world, because in the training, what you do is you are supposed to get prepared to advise organizations, right? So you have to understand how teams work, how organizations work, what is leadership. So you have to think a lot about what kind of leadership styles do we have, but who do I want to be as a leader? Or at least that's what I was thinking about. And how do you solve conflict? So there's a lot of these organizational aspects that are essential in our everyday work that you're never trained on in medicine. So in medicine, that's not part of your curriculum. Somehow in medicine or in research, we assume once people are good content-wise, they're going to be excellent leaders, which is, of course, proving to be a disaster. It simply doesn't work like that. So doing that training, it forced me to really think about, who am I in a team? What is important for a team? How do you bring a team together? Who would I want to be as a leader? I've had good and I've had very bad experiences with leadership, not me having leaders. And so I was thinking about, okay, what did work for them? What didn't? What would I like to do differently, and so forth. And so it gave me the space to reflect about how organizations work, but also who I am in this context of organization. Right. And I think that was really extremely helpful, because it was an opportunity for self-reflection. I was working in a very dysfunctional organization at the time. So the institute I was working was extremely dysfunctional. The leadership was very, very bad. And so to understand why it was dysfunctional, that it wasn't me, there were structural aspects, and the leadership was just acting based on a certain environment where they were placed in. And so, they were kind of trying to comply with certain expectations, which reflected poorly on the rest of the people working there. So to understand all of these things, it was really, really helpful. So it had multiple effects.
So I'm still kind of confused with all the parallel things that you've done. It's like, so, and then saying, yeah, I get bored easily. I cannot imagine you ever being bored with all the stuff that's going on. But it's interesting because obviously we got to know each other through your work in sex and gender medicine and your interest in design thinking and innovation. And I'm so, and there's so much going on that I'm actually kind of like, which question can I actually ask? Because I'm afraid to ask any question because I think there's so much more going on, and I think I know.
I'm trying to streamline.
Yeah, I know. Like, no, but it's amazing. But at the same time, actually, there's a sort of a underlying thing that's going on, which is you being very easy or feeling very at ease with being sort of out of your comfort zone, being an outsider. So you are always reflecting on where you are. So you can always say like, hey, it's not working, or and you're very, it's very easy for you to, because you're the migrant. So it's okay to go somewhere else. So you'll go to South Africa. So, New York is not happening. It takes a few weeks and it's like, okay, well, we have a job in Berlin. And so these are disasters for some people. And for you, it's more like, it's annoying. What else? So, which is a sort of something. Obviously, it's from both your upbringing and it's probably somewhere in your DNA. Your parents were open to these kind of things. You grew up that way, but you ended up with a combination of things that you. Both because you've seen so many different things, but at the same time, you also looked at sort of the systemic part of it, saying, hey, it's public health, there's something wrong with the healthcare systems that we have it. And then you did kind of become, at least in my mind, a little bit of an expert in that field of sex and gender medicine. So in a way, you started kind of becoming this expert. It's still a very big thing because it is systemic, but you are kind of regarded as an expert now. So how does that feel?
Yeah, it's.
Are you stuck? Do you feel a bit stuck now? Like,
yes, I do. Actually, to be honest, I do struggle with it a little bit. But no, first, I think the choice I made in the field. I mean, that I could have picked a specialty. So most of my colleagues that work in the field, they are bound to a certain discipline. So either they're a cardiologist or neurologist or whatever. So they are bound to their discipline, and then they look at sex differences or gender differences sometimes. So my choice from the beginning, just not to make that, to zone in on something too much, was like, okay, I want to see the big picture. So what I do is I really look at implementation on a higher level in terms of I work with a lot of these people together. So they come in as the expert in their discipline, and I bring in the expertise from the sex and gender sensitive methodology. And then we kind of see, okay, how can we work together? Which again puts me always in a learning perspective, right, if you want. And as you said, it's a lot of people wouldn't choose consciously to do that, especially not in the field of university medicine. But I think it's fun. So what we do is we come together and I try to look at what would work in their field and then bring that to a kind of meta level where we can look at it again and say, okay, in that field, this worked, and in this field, this is working, and try to, what can we learn from each other and how can we connect and make a broader network of it? So at least I chose to not pinpoint one specific field of medicine, but I'm looking at it from a broader perspective. And the other thing is I also still I'm kind of branching out a bit also in the, I would say, advocacy and activism part, where you try to, I know a lot of the work that I do is really kind of inform people about what sex and gender sensitive medicine is and why it is important. And I try to work with policymakers and try to make it happen. which is difficult to measure, by the way, with the typical academic standards, because a lot of people go like, oh, but you're not writing enough grants. Yeah, but I'm sitting at the EU Commission and trying to help them and develop things that will help us implement this. So the balance between what I do and the impact I can have is not always visible in the field, which is a marginal problem from my perspective, but it is definitely something that would have to do with the recognition. But yeah, over time, of course, I had also the serendipitous, it was kind of a serendipitous situation to be in this field since a long time while it was developing. And so I became an expert also because I've been in this field for so long. It's a relatively small field. I know pretty much everybody. But I didn't consciously choose. So when I was in medical school, I didn't say, okay, I'm going to do that because it didn't exist. And so what I did was I kind of went with the flow. And as you were saying, and I pivoted a few times, which isn't necessarily easy. And it's like, because it's not that I don't set out a certain goal and I'm like, okay, I want to do that. It's just that when I hit a wall, I think I'm faster in pivoting, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a moment of like, okay, so this didn't work. What now? What happened here? So it does happen, but yeah. So the situation is I'm more of an expert in that field, but still in that expertise, I definitely chose to be more of a generalist as much as possible in that situation.
Oh, that's interesting that yeah, of course. I mean, I think because of all the different kind of things you've seen, the way you've traveled, not just the languages per country, but also the medical languages that you kind of know, put you in a position, an ideal position of being sort of someone who's a connector, who is a generalist. But you are kind of. But I can imagine that there's some tension there because you're in the world of experts, you're specialists, right? And being sort of a generalist in a world of specialists, is that something is that something you feel? Is that something that, because is that accepted? Do you see there, or is there maybe, is there some kind of, it depends maybe on the country where you work, but also, is there a shift? Is there more appreciation for journalists, or is it still?
I think, first of all, there is a bit of a, for decades, in the last decades, the idea was, okay, we need to super specialize. And I think now there is a realization that we need generalists to bring the dots together. Mm-hmm. And again, as I said initially, when you asked me who you are and I told you where I came from, the same thing of, fitting in and not fitting in, that applies to my work as well. So again, yeah. People will look at me and go like, okay, she doesn't have exactly the same CV as we do, but somehow she still, I tick the boxes. I studied medicine and I did residency and I did a master's.
They go through the list like, what's wrong with her? Okay, it looks fine.
But why is she behaving like that? So but since I've been like that for forever, I know with the years you learn to navigate that. And it really becomes an asset. The further you go, because you learn how to, I know that people have these I don't know, questions and somewhat, they might feel a bit uneasy, like, well, what is it that we're doing here? So I know how to communicate with them and how to bring them in and eventually show them, where I'm trying to go and so forth. And I think that that helps in having had all these years of experience and being in that position. And again, I think in my professional position, I'm doing that again, and in a way, and I probably will keep doing that for the rest of my life, because that's just simply who I am. And I cannot really, I cannot, and I probably don't strive, because I know I wouldn't succeed. I don't strive to fitting into that kind of measurement. But of course, it's challenging because you put yourself between different systems, and when it comes, for example, to evaluation criteria, you don't really fit, and it's like, but here that's less, but she did all of that, and there's no box for that. So that is something you have to struggle with, and I think you have to make a choice about or do I comply and try to tick more of the boxes, Or do I think, who cares? I'll just go on my way. And where I'm right now, it is, especially here in the Netherlands, and it's surprising because I didn't think, but especially here in the research system, you do have to tick a lot of boxes. And innovation is good, but as long as it fits into our concept of innovation. And so I'm deciding to, who cares? I'm just going to do my thing and deal with it. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to move again. So that's kind of
Exactly. Right.
Well, in a way, I think it's so important, and that's something we don't teach people when they start their careers. A lot of the emphasis in helping people to access the job market is in trying to teach them to fit into a call or to fit into an organization, right? So what we're trying to do is support people in fitting into the job rather than teaching them to recognize themselves, to recognize their values, and recognize which kind of work environment they need and they would thrive in, and then go out and look for that, which would make them much more happy in whatever job they do. So it's two completely different positions, and especially in the field I work in, and I mean the biomedical field is relatively conservative in that, and really the question about who you are, what kind of things do you want to reach, and what kind of work environment do you need, are really not questions we tend to ask to people in our field.
It's difficult to teach as well, because one of the things I think is important in the way you kind of learned things is not just it's school, it's life, it's travel, it's seeing different things. So I mean, if you don't do all those things, or you're not put in a position that you're able to do these things, it's scary, because like you said, you have to kind of experience being unrooted, every now and then, to understand that actually it's okay. It makes you stronger. It isn't scary. You can survive. You become way more agile because of it. But if you don't, it sounds really scary. Like I don't know where to go, and my plan didn't go ahead, and of course for you obviously, if things don't go the way you want them, you get frustrated. You go like, why is it this way? Because you are that's interesting. You said you have this activist perspective, so there's always this feeling of this is not perfect, I should change it. But you are also courageous because you'll survive. You can go somewhere else, so you can be yourself. But if you don't have that confidence or that experience, and how can you teach? How can you teach this?
Well, but I think first of all, there are, even simple coaching techniques where you can start helping people focusing on, who they are. And what are your core values? And these are different for all of us. And just being aware of, initially when I said the thing about social justice and social impact, I didn't realize that until my 30s, that's what I was actually going after. So I was doing the stuff that felt right. I was making, some gut choices, but I didn't realize that was the core of it. And I only realized that through introspection, if you want, doing some of these coaching things where you kind of try to figure out, who am I really? So what's essential? So for me, if you ask me about my core values, I'll tell you, independence, social activism, change, and all those things. These are core things for me that I thrive on, that, make me engaged in the work and everything. Other people will tell you, I want certainty and safety and things that can be planned. And that's perfectly fine. It's not that one thing is better than the other. But knowing yourself, I think that core, and you can teach that anywhere. So learning to understand who you are and what it is that you need, and kind of requesting that. You cannot go in a job interview and say, okay, I want certainty. But if you know that that's something that's important to you, you can scan job options knowing that this is something you would like. And then if you go in there and you have a look at, how is the office, how are the people, that's something you can ask about. And these things we don't really teach people, to try to be more in touch with what it is that they need, and to make sure that that other job looks wonderful on paper, but maybe it simply doesn't work for you, and that doesn't make you wrong. It just is not a fit. And realizing that a lot of jobs do not work, not because the person is not qualified or the organization is bad, but simply because that person and that organization are not a fit on let's say core values. That is something we don't really look that much into, but that's something you can do anywhere. You don't have to move anywhere to do that. You don't necessarily have to have that life experience being shuffled around everywhere to take the time and kind of figure out what it is that I would like to see in my workplace. We spend so much time at work that it is something we should try. You should try to make the possible decisions you can. Of course, there are situations where you have no choice, and we also have to acknowledge that. I mean, it's a very privileged discussion that we're having here. Let's face that. You know, there are a lot of people that might not have these choices, and at that point, you have completely different priorities. But if you do have the opportunity to make those choices, then you might as well try to investigate a bit more into what it is that you need, and from there, where would you like to go?
Right. And well, even if you don't have the luxury, it's always good to kind of know what you are about, because you might be unhappy with where you are, and it might not change things, but to kind of know why. It's always good, right? It's always good. Like, okay, this is who I am. This is why I'm frustrated or struggling. So you know where it's from. So that's a good point. I mean, I think that's something you can teach at school. You can involve students in those kind of introspections and learn how to reflect on who you are and where you're from. And but we're not going to be all migrants. Obviously, we're not all going to be activists, because one of the things obviously you do is you want things to change. So there's also people who are kind of work in the system, and they like to be in that system, and they're happy in that system, or they don't want it to change. Obviously, that's why it's so difficult to change things, because there's lots of those people who are afraid of change, or at least they don't like because they don't know what's going to happen when things change. But you want things to change, and we haven't really talked about sex and gender medicine, and besides that, that's sort of your field of interest and work at the moment. It's interesting that you just said it's kind of frustrating that you're kind of stuck in this topic, but I would love you to stay in that topic for a while, because I think it's really important, and we need people like you to kind of address that. But can you briefly? And I know it's a big thing. There's lots to talk about, but still, for people who are not familiar, and I wasn't familiar with that not that long ago, and it was very eye-opening to hear some of your stories. But why is it important to have a focus there? Why are people focusing on that?
Well, I chose it for a reason, because there's a lot to do. So the point of sex and gender sensitive medicine is really realizing that both biological sex differences and gender aspects have an impact on healthcare. And for decades, the biomedical research field has really focused on a human being, and I say that in quotation marks, that was mostly a male body. And most of research was organized around that, or even, sometimes we would even work with maybe female cells, but we wouldn't even be aware of the fact that sex was simply not a variable that was taken into consideration. And then in the late 90s, it became clear that the symptoms that you can experience with a heart attack, and later on we realized with a lot of other diseases, be it asthma or be it, Parkinson's disease, or osteoporosis or depression, many diseases, when you ask men and women about their symptoms, they will describe probably slightly different symptoms, which can lead to delayed diagnosis and possibly can affect also the therapies that we're giving. So that's one aspect. And especially if you're in the group that is being neglected, the consequences for your health could be relatively dramatic. And then what's coming in addition to looking at these biological sex differences, is that we're realizing more and more how gender aspects play a role here. So gender identity and gender roles and gender relations all impact the way we interact with other human beings in a healthcare consultation, in how far that impacts our quality of life and so forth. And what we're also trying to do is see if we can measure these things in the biomedical field, and trying to improve people's quality of life, the care they're receiving, whether they're being given the attention they should be given. And in addition to that, we of course living in a world where the concept of gender is evolving, and we're realizing that there's not just a gender identity, woman and men. There's many others, and people don't really fit into tiny boxes. And how do you bring that in? And the next evolution then is not all women and all men and all non-binary people are the same. So how do we take into account that? But that's the research part. The clinical part is really how do we make sure that everybody is listened to appropriately, regardless of sex or gender. So ideally, in the end, we wouldn't need to have to look at sex and gender at all. But to get there, we need to make clear that right now this is being ignored and it's important. And so we want to improve the care for everybody at the end of the day, make sure that everybody gets the best diagnostic procedures and gets the therapies that will possibly cure them as much as possible and give them as little side effects as possible. And also make sure that everybody feels welcome in the healthcare system, so that you go to your doctor and they don't look strange at you because they don't know exactly where to place you, but they know how to talk to you, even if you don't fit into the expectation the doctor might have towards you. But you look strange. Who are you? I don't even know how to address you. And that it's perfectly normal to ask people, well, how would you like to be called? How would you like to be addressed? What kind of, why are you here? How can we address your needs and your concerns and so forth? So there's a lot to do.
There's a lot to, but I as a complete outsider, it sounds like, oh, okay, so now we know. Let's tell everyone. And that's it. Right? So
that's the thing I meant before with the implementation. I mean, we knew a lot of these things even 10 years ago.
Exactly. So now we know.
But knowledge doesn't transfer by osmosis. So it's not like I put the knowledge out there and now everybody sees that it makes sense. I'm going to do it. I think we've seen that happening in recent times also quite well. There was a lot of scientific information out there during the pandemic. But then, what do you pick? What do you believe? What is right? And giving also people the instruments to make choices, to see how this can be integrated is challenging. And at the level of sex and gender, it's not. We don't necessarily have exactly the same polarization as we saw during the COVID pandemic, discussing COVID. But we know that gender is a subject where a lot of people are like, oh, gender. So that's something I don't believe in that. I mean, sometimes people say they tell me I don't believe in that, and I'm puzzled because what does that? It's not a religion, but it sometimes it's portrayed as a religion, as an ideology that wants to convince people of inexistent things. The fact is, we're all performing gender all the time, whether we want it or not, whether we're aware of it or not. It's there, it's ingrained in our societies. And we mostly live in historically patriarchal societies where some things are just normal. It's just the way they're done. But that doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just where we might be aware of that.
So I get that in general, but so it's still, so for instance, one of the stories I think you told me was about Parkinson. So my father has Parkinson, and so it was kind of stuck with me a little bit, where there was sort of if you have Parkinson as a man, your symptoms could be different than when you are a woman, and women get sent to a psychologist, like, you must be stressed, are you really busy? And where men are diagnosed with Parkinson and they go to a specialist. So then you're like, okay, so then you tell the doctors, like, hey, wait, there's this difference. here's a leaflet, something, or you go to a conference and they'll tell you, and then you're like, oh, I didn't know that. And there was also something that if you have a female house doctor, GP, then you are more lucky because they will be more open to those kind of differences. And I was like, but then you just tell the doctors, like, hey, it's different, or like with heart disease. So like, hey, wait a minute. So women might have different symptoms. So you just tell them, and they're doctors, and they want to help people. That's why they become doctors. So now they know. Not?
Yeah, that would be, if implementation were that linear, we wouldn't have implementation research.
Yeah, but I don't get
Like,
it. If I was a doctor and I have this kind of this lens that makes me blind to certain things, and someone says, do you know you're actually, your diagnosis could be wrong. I have some new information for you. For women, it might be different. It's a very specific, thing. And you are, you're a doctor, so you get trained all the time, and you're interested, you want to help people. Well,
it's a bit, well, first of all, I would say that in some cases people genuinely don't know, and they hear about it and they try to implement it in their practice. But then there's other layers. So one other layer is the one you were mentioning before, becoming the expert, becoming the so if you've been in practice for 25 years and you have done things a certain way for 25 years and you never considered this as an essential aspect to take into account, now comes somebody maybe younger than you telling you, okay, listen, this should be done differently. Right. It will question, you will have to question not just your practice, but part of your professional identity, because it is so interwoven. So it's a change process that has a knowledge component, but it of course has other aspects as well. So that's point number one. The other one is, some people are reluctant and they will tell you, well, but we don't have really huge studies that demonstrate that this is true. And for a lot of aspects in sex and gender sensitive medicine, that's true, because since it wasn't researched for decades, we don't have that many huge studies that prove all of this. We will have to do a lot of these really big studies to prove that. So we have a lot of information pointing in one, we are accumulating a lot more information. But the way science works is also, you keep accumulating knowledge, and at a certain point you're like, okay, this is enough now. We will change the guideline. And when somebody comes into your office, this is the diagnosis you can give only if you have done these diagnostic tests. But the diagnostic tests have to be done differently. But then that's what a lot of people will also tell you, well, why don't you change the guidelines? And to change the guidelines, which is a very long process where you need to have a lot of evidence, which is important, and it's good that it's like that, but it also means you need to accumulate really big studies and a lot of evidence. And to do that, you need to do all of that, and that costs a lot of money. And it means that people need to do those studies. So, it is all somewhat connected. So first of all, now we're raising awareness. We are getting more attention to this. So what this means is that we can hope that in this time and in the coming years, we will accumulate a lot more knowledge. By the time we have enough studies, let's say we need 3, 4, 5 that say the same thing, then we can change the guidelines, and then it can go into practice. That's the way it works in medicine.
Yeah, and so that's the way it works in medicine, and I get it. Like it works in many industries, by the way. Usually it's a systemic problem, but it also for the general public. So one of the things, being aware. So for women, for instance, to know that when you are having a heart attack, it might feel different than what you've learned were the male symptoms. And you might not have those as a female, so you might have experienced that differently. So that information should also be taught to the general public, I guess, because they can help, also. Because so that's it's a huge task, but I think raising awareness. And I don't know if that's true, but I do hear more of it. There's more. Yeah. It's on television more often. I read it in a newspaper the other day. So there's articles. So is that true? Is there more?
No, definitely. I mean, there are several colleagues here also in the Netherlands who are working on it. Some of them have been working on it for a really long time. I've been here for 4.5 years, but it's not like I brought it here. So there were already a lot of people working on it before as well. But what we're seeing is the topic is getting more attention at the moment. It also has a bit to do with the fact that at the European level, it was getting a lot more attention, and that trickles down to the different countries who try to pick it up. So it's true for the Netherlands. It's also true for Germany. It's true for Italy to a certain degree. In Spain, it's also being, and then of course you work with people and it takes time. So like, let's say I gave a talk last year. We did a workshop in a relatively big research organization in Lisbon. So we did this workshop about sex and gender, why it impacts their research and so forth. And for a while, I didn't really hear anything. They're working internally on this. And now on the 8th of March, the director of these foundations board actually gave an interview of a page and a half on a major national newspaper saying how important it is for them to consider sex in their research. So sometimes you also don't know, you plant some seeds, you go in there, you do a workshop, you do a lecture, you talk to somebody, you leave, you have no idea what's going to happen, and then things organically somehow diffuse, and you get to see the fruits later on. So that's also another aspect. So I think that's why it's so important to have these communication aspects. It's also true, as we saw with some of our research on COVID-19, that the fact that it is in the media is important for the general public, but it doesn't necessarily change the practice in medicine. So in a way, is you're raising like critical mass at the general population level, but it will take time until that goes back to the clinical practice that needs to be changed. You're basically creating a pressure group, if you want. Yeah. So the hope is that in informing the general public, you are creating pressure groups, if you want, critical masses, call it whichever way you want, that will then go and, lobby, in quotation marks, their physicians, or, if they know policymakers, they will ask and say, well, this is important. Why is this not happening? And so that translates back into potentially, hopefully, more funding to do more research on this so that we get more knowledge and we can change things from inside.
Right. Clear. And so what's next for you?
Well, I don't know. I'll say since last year, I picked up another professor. So I have two professorships right now.
Yeah.
One in Germany and one in the Netherlands. And it's an interesting situation. And on the one hand side, it gives me very different insights. And it's kind of interesting to see both perspectives. On the other side, it's two systems. And as I said initially, I always have a bit of a challenge in complying with systems. So I'm just wondering if in the long run, it's going to be too much system. So ideally, I'm probably going to drop one of the two and end up doing maybe 80% and keep a day a week open to do some other things. So that's what I see in the 5-year horizon. But who knows, our world is changing rapidly. Things are very unpredictable at the moment. I have no idea. I mean, maybe that next year something falls in front on my way, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I wasn't planning on that, but this is really great. Maybe I should do this. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think that one should try to walk through life open for serendipitous changes. I mean, you can always decide if you want to take them or not. But for me, it's like I kind of have a plan. But several times it turned out that the plan didn't reach its goal quite like I thought it would. Maybe it reached it in a different way, maybe even more successfully. But the plan not necessarily will come to fruition exactly as I thought. And I'm kind of open for that. So I don't know. I mean, cool. I think I kind of have a certain setup now for the coming years, but you never know.
Exactly. Yeah. So that fits very well with your story. You just don't know. Go with the flow.
Yeah, and I think it's good. It's maybe another message for the next generations is also, especially in my field where careers tend to be quite linear, you don't necessarily have to know all the time. So it was it wasn't easy to get to the point where, you know, where I say, okay, I don't know, I'm going to be fine. But to get to that point wasn't easy. If somebody had told me, I probably wouldn't have listened. But if somebody had told me like 15 years, 20 years ago, don't worry, it will go completely differently, but you will be fine. It would have been helpful, and also to know you don't have to know exactly where you're going.
Right.
Somehow, you know, try to decide somehow where you want to go, but then just accept the fact that it might go in a completely different way and it's still going to be okay.
Yeah, and even if it does go exactly the way you planned it, it's going to be different in reality anyway, because you don't really know what you're choosing. And while you're doing it, it turns out to be totally different than you thought anyway. But that's yeah. So good advice, I think, for people to also to kind of realize that things kind of happen, and
Yeah.
and you know,
Absolutely.
like, yeah, things just happen. Crisis. I mean, we've known a lot of crises by now in our lifetime, and they change things, and you cannot do anything about it. So use them, or use that as a source of more a source of energy than of frustration, and letting it, you know, bog you down. It's actually a way of saying, okay, we're next.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What do we do now?
What do we do now? So, what do we do now? So, thank you very much for the conversation. I love that.
You.
Yeah, and please do stay with the sex and gender medicine for a while, because it's important.
I think I will.
We need you. We need you. And I would love to kind of find out where this adventure is going to take you next. But for now, thank you so much for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.